Don't waste your time learning how to crochet. It literally took me 1 hour and my first attempt of creating a straighter edge in my series of learning how to create a granny square, which turned out like this in my first attempt. And then my actual first attempt of creating a granny square turned out to be more of a granny circle. But I'm showing you guys this because I'm showing you the true cost of learning the hobby. Not just the material cost, but also the cost when it comes to learning, accessibility, and community. And in my last video, I did touch on community by showing you guys a group that meets in the library called the Library Loopers, which meets casually and talks about their different crochet, knit, and other craft projects. I found this so helpful that I decided to put it onto my website called Argue is Fun, where you can find other fun activities within the Raleigh-Durham area, sorting by price and location of suburb. But reflecting on my journey when it comes to crochet, I realized that I wasn't really maxing out with all my resources. Yes, I can learn tips and tricks from different people and also watch some tutorials on the internet, but since my last video, you guys have been really supportive with providing comments and advice on how I can crochet a little bit better, especially in my attempt of trying to create a granny square. But to be honest, I am a little bit scared because it's been 8 days since I picked up a crochet hook and a ball of yarn. But I am determined that with my newfound advice and your guys' support, I'm going to do this even better. By first getting a light color yarn and a crochet hook. Then getting the pattern of the crochets that I can see on my computer. Then having the ability to create a real slip knot. Because my first slip knot was actually very loose at the bottom, and that's because I didn't use my crochet hook as a good reference point to tighten up my slip knot. That's important because you can see here in my first crochet circle, it was much more looser, and then the real slip knot is much more tighter at the end. This is also important as I continue on to create my crochet chain, because when I was trying to create my crochet circle for my granny square, I thought the area I needed to enter into was the slip knot, when in actuality it should be the first chain above the slip knot. And this makes a difference because when you can see in this video, my real slip knot crochet circle looked much more tighter and neater, while the one that had a much more looser circle looked more unruly and it wasn't looking as even as the one at the bottom. Because then I make another mistake. Instead of crocheting in the center of the circle like at the bottom video, I started my crochet in the chain of the crochet circle. And this makes a difference because it made it much more harder on myself to crochet new rows. At the top video, it was much more harder for me to rearrange and try to make a new row, while the bottom video was much more easier. As well as I was trying to make sure I was much more neater at the bottom video. I tried to make sure that I was rearranging and just crocheting a little bit slower so that way I can make my rows neat. Well, in the video at the top when I first was doing it, I was following the motions of what the instructor was doing and not making sure that my rows were a little bit neater. Another thing to keep in mind is that I had this string at the bottom of my crochet that I tried to push away, and I did a good job on both videos, but I think in the last video at the bottom, I was much more mindful to making sure I didn't crochet inside my crochet square, as well as making sure that I was keeping, again, my rows are neat and aligned. And then another thing to make sure when I was doing this video is that at the bottom video, I was much more neater by counting the rows that I was crocheting. See, in the video, she really counted double crochets that she was making, and in the top video, again, I was following more of the motions and I was counting, but not very strict with every single row. At the bottom video, I did make sure I was counting, so that way it made sense to make sure that with each row I was making, it followed along to what I was seeing in the video and not just what I was hearing or trying to watch her movements on. And then lastly, another thing I try to make sure when I was crocheting is, again, making sure everything is nice and neat, but in a different way, making sure that my corners are much more straighter. And you can see here when I was doing my final analysis, I was doing small steps by making sure that each row aligned to what I was seeing in the video and making sure things are looking a little bit more straighter. And keeping in mind keeping things straight, one mistake that I made in the top video you can see is that I'm holding my crochet the whole entire time that I'm crocheting. This seems like a good thing to do, but this was a slight error on my part because when I was crocheting with my hands, the crochet was much more looser, which means it was most likely to curve, and this curving allowed the circle effect on my first granny square attempt. But in the second one that I did at the bottom, you can see it's much more neater because one thing I did was placing my crochet on a flat surface throughout the time I was crocheting. Doing this helped me not only see if I was going straight on my edges, but during times when I wanted to know during the times that I knew I wanted to create something more linear, I would put it flat on the table and crochet up instead of what I was doing on the top video, which is crocheting up but more in a circle motion because I had to crochet in my hands. Another thing that I did was trying to make sure when I was creating those edges was keeping in mind how I made my corners. In my first video on top, I made my corners by guesstimating when it was the next time to do my 3 crochet up in a chain. But in the video at the bottom, one thing that I did when I was doing my 3 crochet up in a chain was making sure I was counting my crochet but looking for the 3 double crochet pattern that the video or instructor of the video was saying. This is important because when I was counting the rows, it also allowed me to know when it was the appropriate time to create my 3 chains. And this is important because this will allow me to again create a sharper edge, and it also gave me the freedom to push down some of the crochet that I was creating, so that way I have more space to create a new row. And then speaking when it comes to creating a new row, one thing I was learning was creating a slip stitch. Now in my first video on top, I did want to change the color and go to a purple. But at the bottom video, I did change my color. I don't think color really made a difference, but I could see the distinct difference when it came to what was the mistake I did when it came to my slip stitch. In the first video at the bottom, I took my crochet hook and went inside the chain, but I was going in and out in a motion where I was going on top of the existing chain. But in the video on top, when I was doing my slip stitch, I was crocheting in a way where I was going in a circling around the chain. This made a difference because it made it less neat and also made it harder to go back in when I wanted to create a new row. This is important to notice because you can see how this made a much more even look on the bottom slips, on my bottom granny square, because when I made a new row, it didn't look as, to me, unruly or scraggly as the one on top. Another thing to keep in mind is that I also made sure when I was creating those new rows, the edges were looking clean, but in the video on top, I noticed that some of the edges, especially when I was going into purple, looked more like flower petals or like mini triangles. This is because, again, I wasn't trying to keep the rows as straight, and it was, again, part of why it was getting harder to create other areas or other sections of my granny square. Now, if you're watching this video and you're finding this helpful, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to someone who you know might be starting to crochet or still in the learning path, because it's still pretty cool to see how people are still watching the same type of tutorial or video to get the same understanding of how to create a granny square. Now, the video I referenced is Hooked by Robin, and the great thing about this video that I was referencing to make my granny square is that she also had a blog, and the blog was really helpful because I referenced the blog when it came to creating the crochet pattern. And the crochet pattern also helped me keep me in line to make sure not only I was doing exactly what I needed to do, but helped me see where my mistakes are when I was doing this granny square this second time. As I continued on creating this granny square, it also made me realize when it came to creating equal spacing of how my holes or the little spaces inside my granny square were looking much more neater. Again, in the beginning of my video, it looked pretty good when I was starting out my granny square on the top, but you can see at the end when I was finishing up my granny square, the bottom video looked much more neater because the spacing and patterns were looking much more even and straighter. And again, it's not exactly like what I saw in the video, but it's a good reference to note when you are starting your granny square, it won't look exactly the same. When it came to the time spent, on the first day when I was doing this granny square, it was around 1 hour and 37 minutes. And on the second day when I was finishing up this granny square, it took 1 hour and 47 minutes. In total, it took me 3 hours to finish my granny square, so I guess I shaved my time by 1 hour. But even in that progress of learning how to create my granny square, it just shows how even though when you're learning this skill and trying to pick it up, you can still make progress and make little changes to become a little bit better each time. But let's see if this granny square will give me enough confidence to do another project that I hopefully will get to have your guys' input, because I feel like now that I can undeniably make circles and now I can make squares, can this allow me, give me a chance to do something even bigger?